Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Kim. I am 65. I am about 5'6" in height, and I've got medium-length blonde hair, and I'll be speaking in English. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you very much. So, I am a physiotherapist. I'm not a design professional, and that's what's brought me to this space. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how I came into the inclusive design world, how I did some research, and the central part of my work is empathy, teaching empathy in design, which is not a tick box exercise. So because of my research, I got invited to be part of the iDesign team at Cambridge University, and I now teach at various other universities and Loughborough universities. So, a great day to hold a conference, International Disabilities Day. As a physiotherapist for 40 years, I specialise in neurology, and I have seen the barriers that the built environment and our services and products can produce, a lot of which we can get rid of. But 1.3 billion people have significant disability, and that's without the ones that are even measured. That means 1 in 6 of us. So universal design, inclusive design, accessible design, human-centric design is something for all of us, if 1 in 6 of us, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that. What scares me most, and what I've seen as a physiotherapist, is that people with disabilities have twice more likelihood of having health inequalities, which means that there are barriers that we can reduce for them to live a fulfilled life. And the environment and employment and education is often a barrier that we can reduce. So what brought me to this space? As I said, I'm not a design professional, I'm a health professional. So for 40 years, as a neurophysiotherapist and an ergonomist, I looked at systems. And the systems was telling me that we have the medical model of disability, where we label somebody and we give them a disability label, a wheelchair, crutches, we give them a condition. But actually, it's the social model of disability that we're in control of getting rid of those barriers. And so it's the social model that made me start looking. The Mind the Gap picture is from London. This is our trains. We have a terrible transport system. What I'd like to talk a little bit about is the transport accessibility gap, the fact that this isn't about just designing one building with an accessible toilet and a ramp. It's the end-to-end user journey. It's the whole customer journey from the beginning to the end for someone to live a fulfilling, independent, inclusive life. With this gap in London, only last week, one of our members of parliament with his blind dog fell through the gap. And so because he's a member of parliament, it's made the news. But it's happening all the time. And we had a person with visual disabilities sadly lose their life in London. That problem's becoming more of a problem in London because we've now bought bullet trains from Japan. And they are non-tilting trains, and so we were going to do HS2 from London to Manchester. That scheme has now been scrapped, but because the trains don't tilt, the gap between the curved stations and the trains will be larger. So it's a problem that's it can be worse in some areas, not necessarily better. The bottom picture was somebody that sent it to me who'd planned his journey, a man working in BBC Wales, who basically had planned his journey, lift was working the other end, got the other end to find that there was no end point to his journey, so he couldn't complete his task, even though he'd planned. And on the top right, this is Eurostar. This is an example of service delivery, end-to-end user involvement. So in Paris, the person could get on the train with help, accessible service. They got to London and the service delivery rules were different. A member of staff is not allowed to push somebody with a wheelchair. So that end-to-end journey experience was not truly inclusive because it wasn't the whole user journey. These are just pictures that I'm sent on a regular basis. Accessible, universal, human-centric design is not a tick box. It's not an add-on. You have to make it integral with your stakeholders from the very, very, very beginning of any project. From when you're planning a project, before your planning even goes in, because for sustainable and resilience and for cost effectiveness, inclusive design in the early stages is the only way to go. It's the main thing. So whoever designed the one on the left, I think, was having a bad day with the exit at the bottom of a staircase for disabled exit. And you can see some of these ramps are put in around the world literally because we need to add that, and we all know, as we're going to talk about in a moment, about we're all going to be facing accessibility. I do a lot with children. I used to work at Great Ormond Street, so turning circles for wheelchairs are always allowing enough. In the UK, we do the minimum standards for developers to comply. So often it's the smallest amount of space we can get away with to comply with the regulations. And that isn't necessarily what a wheelchair or somebody with accessible needs would actually need. So I get sent these photos all the time, and this is why I did the research, because it was just firing something inside of me, thinking we can change this. We have the ability to change it. So I don't know the situation here in Latvia, but certainly in the UK, we still have a very disability-centric society. So we design for the people on the left with permanent disabilities, those that are registered with the medical model. And yet we know, with the line on the bottom, our ability as humans, which is what I've studied for 40 years, which is the human body, is changing all the time. So a virus, COVID, we learned through that all of a sudden this wasn't about having a condition that we were labelled with. So don't just design for the permanent disabilities on the left. Design for the whole continuum. And if design is flexible, it will accommodate all of those sectors. You can have situational disability, so a mother holding a baby and you're one-handed, on a telephone, cooking. There could be all kinds of things, a broken limb, coming back from a ski holiday, post-viral infection. There are so many times when, I'm sure every one of us here have had times when we've felt that we're not fully capable of doing something, and we then notice, but we sometimes only notice when it affects us. And that's what I think the empathy and education with our future design students, collaborations with stakeholders is so important. What's not on here are the invisible disabilities. Let's not forget the invisible disabilities. In the UK, at least, there's 17% of people with ADHD and autism, and they're only the ones that we know about and people that self-report. And in the UK alone, we think there's about 18% of people who are registered with a disability, 21% in Wales. And again, they're only the ones that make the medical model of a disability. So that's a far greater number. So we talk a lot about inclusive design, accessible design, universal design. Being an ergonomist and being a physiotherapist, I like human-centric design. Because I think if we keep empathy and the needs of a human being at the center, then human-centred design encapsulates all of those other terminologies, whichever terminology we use. So as design professionals and stakeholders in the disability space, we have the ability at an early stage to design in and design out, design in access and design out barriers, which is the most cost-effective resilience for any project timeline. But do we know our users? I started to look at empathy and measure empathy because I wanted to understand what your world, your design world, really looks at when you design. So understanding the diversity of needs is key, but designing in flexibility is key, because if it's designed in at the early stage, then retrofitting is very cost effective. So I'm not going to list all of these, but as a physio, obviously all of my career, I've looked at human capability considerations. Accessibility isn't just about a ramp and a toilet. It's about the fact with a globally aging population, we've got 16% of the world will be over 65 by 2050. So that will affect all of us. So we're designing and future-proofing. In Ireland now, all new homes have to have downstairs bathing and toilet facilities to accommodate future-proofing. And that's your world. That's completely within your ability to hold that. So it's not just about vision, memory, hearing, dexterity. It's also gender equality and religious considerations too. So this is your world, but it wasn't my world. So I started looking at what is human-centred design. And I know there's probably many people here from the design and architectural technical world that talk about this iterative design. And everything I looked at in my literature search looked at empathy being the first stage. And I kept asking myself, well, how, as designers, architects, planners, do you empathize? You can do an empathy map, you can do personas, but how do you really understand? So I went back to what I know best, which is neurology, and I went back to the neuroscience because that's where I felt most comfortable in the evidence base. So I did a little bit of research. Sadly, it was going to be a much bigger study, but it was in COVID. And suddenly ethics said that you can't do that anymore, so I had to do it remotely. So what I did, this is a picture of one of the architects in my study. So I measured empathy. I thought, well, we talk about empathy, but what actually is it from a neuroscience point of view? We talk about walking in somebody's shoes, but they talk about it, walking in someone's shoes to understand a user need, so how do we do it? So, the neuroscience, this is what fascinated me more, and I'm sure some of you have heard of it. So, 20 years ago it was developed, so in the monkey brain, with Kilner and Lehman, we found that monkeys could mimic. If you mimicked someone's actions under a functional MRI and a scanner, we knew that they were feeling their pain, feeling their emotion. And the more that we mimic that action, we develop more neurons. We're building a neural map, which is why they say the more that you practice empathy, the better you get at it. And what I measured, there's two types of empathy. There's trait empathy, which is the empathy that you're born with, your baseline personality. But I measured state empathy. State empathy is something that is measured through an educational intervention. And it's used a lot in healthcare and in nursing, and so I thought, why don't we apply it to architects? What I love about the mirror neuron, it imitates an observational learning. So that's where it lays down its basis. So because of COVID, I had to do this remotely. So I developed a remote empathy kit with Cambridge University simulation glasses and dexterity gloves. I developed 9 activities of daily living, and I posted this to architects. They also had to produce their normal CAD design, so something they would normally do quite happily in their daytime, but now with simulation. I would like to say that I say in any simulation that I do, simulation is never the lived experience, and it will never mimic the lived experience. It is purely nudging their design thinking. So they had to perform these tasks, and as a result of this, we got some measures. I did a quant analysis and a qualitative with some interviews. So the blue bars are the score before. I did a psychometric scale where I measured their empathy, then they performed the tasks, then I remeasured their empathy levels. And all of the candidates that participated, their empathy levels went up between 13 and 75%. What was really interesting, though, is the 75% uplift, the blue is before, the orange is afterwards, is that the older designers only went up 30%. One, that's because they were older themselves and probably beginning to get visual and dexterity issues themselves. And secondly, they've been around the accessible, inclusive design world for a lot longer. The 75% were 2 fresh out of university architects that were fit, triathletes, didn't have any issues. So it was interesting that this was really insightful for them. What I loved more than anything, though, was the qualitative data. This was words taken out from their interview. So I'm not going to read them all out, but this was an hour-and-a-half's intervention of simulated capability loss. And in that time, words like frustrating, hard to imagine, I felt hopeless, I felt debilitated, it increased my awareness, it would teach me to design with the senses, challenging, affected my mood. So it wasn't just, what really fascinated me, it wasn't just the physical capability loss that we'd layered, it was the psychological impact. They were getting some output saying, wow, I can take off this simulated experience, but people with the lived experience live this every single day. And I thought that was incredibly insightful for a very simple, low-cost intervention that lasted an hour and a half. These were some of the key quotes. Again, I won't read them all out for you because I think you're going to get the slide pack. But they were saying, after this intervention, the building regulations offer only the minimal accessible standard. We need to do so much more. It makes you realise how important your senses are. I found myself having to think laterally and use other senses to navigate my tasks. And I love the last one. I will keep the annoyance and frustration I felt in the back of my mind, and I will think of designing with all the senses going forward. So these are quite insightful quotes from something that was really quite simple because we were able to measure the input. Being a physio, we measure everything, so it's natural for me to measure. So this was a key takeaway quote. This intervention changed my subconscious design assumptions, introducing humility in design and better understanding my users' needs. So we can shift mindsets. We can change people's minds with for me, I like empathic interventions because I feel that we're also building that neural map. So further studies, I'm now doing a longitudinal study at Loughborough. So this is design students in the architecture faculty at Loughborough University, where they go around the building, we look at wayfinding lifts, toilets and doors. They come back with any issues, then we layer them with capability loss, then they go around and they explore again. So they're basically redoing it with capability loss. So why architectural empathy? Because you are key. You have the ability as designers and planners of the built environment and for products and services to design out exclusion. And you are the missing link with the exclusion gap. So these are just some examples that you can look at of some good design. This was the Royal College of Arts. If you are going to do design, take out stigma. Don't just use accessible products. Put chairs in the middle of normal seating where there's arms so that people can get up really easily. The middle of the picture is the National Royal Institute of British Architects with listed buildings where the ramps at the sides have been very tastefully put in and there is no separate disabled access. Everybody goes through the same door to reduce stigma. On the right, we've got two pictures from DCA company, big design company that do a lot of our trains and accessible trains. And this was for HS2, where they looked a lot at turning circles and needs for wheelchairs on trains, and with very good design. And there was not a separate toilet for anybody else, it was one toilet. So I've got 3 slides at the end which can be sent to you, which are full of resources. So I'm not going to go through all the resources in detail, but the resources give you links to all of the documents in the UK that you can look at in your own time. This is our legislation, the Part M regulations. It's very basic, and it basically means a toilet and a ramp, which is nowhere near enough. The third one down, the British standards, I've also put a link in, and that is the BS 8300. That says to do a lot more, but again, developers in the UK will only do what they need to do, and often you find them saying, do I have to do that? Do I have to do a bigger toilet? Do I have to do a bigger bathroom? I would say, and I'm not the expert in the room here, but if you are going to design toilets, try and put them in the middle of the room so that people with left and right-handed capability the toilet from both sides, because just putting it to one side means that you can differentiate between half of the users. I don't know if you have it here, but we have changing places in the UK. So these are now with our disability group stakeholders, where people who need hoists and complete changing facilities are scattered around the UK, which is so much more than just an accessible toilet. And I've put the link there as well. I've put this resource here as well. This is a great architect in the UK who is a wheelchair user himself and has done lots and lots of accessible buildings with historic monuments and government buildings. So the link at the end, if you can go in each of those, you'll see the projects and how they've navigated listed building, architectural buildings, the whole sensitivity of designing well with architecture. This is also a really good example of a hotel in Manchester called the Brooklyn. I love it, and that's because the hotel owner is a wheelchair user. And so it's very accessible with no stigma. All the rooms are the same. You don't have to have a special room. And the top photograph shows you the lighting in the ceiling. That is not actually lighting. That is a hoist, ceiling hoist that comes out of the ceiling and is lowered, but is completely discreet for use at need. So this slide and the next slide are just 2 free toolkits that we use at Cambridge University, where you can use the measure, this one and this one, where you can upload your own images, and it simulates 6 visual acuity losses, and that means that you can then look at percentage of the population that will be excluded with the image that you're trying to upload, be it a built environment image or be it a digital image. We've also got a new PAS that's come out in the UK, Design for the Mind. And again, I've put the link in the resources. And this is just recognising that not all disabilities are visible, and how we can design neurodiverse and neuroatypical workplaces. So for me, a key takeaway is remembering these 2 things. Disability is part of being human. Everybody will temporarily or permanently experience disability at some stage in their life. And I love the one on the end by Judith Kerman. Disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things needed to lead one's life daily. Thank you very much for this opportunity.